Hey, folks. Welcome back to Politics Chat, where we're going to I didn't ask for questions today because I think everybody has the same things on their minds. I'm going to delay a little bit here while we wait for the Facebook people to come on. Welcome to everybody from so many different places. I hope they are as brilliantly beautiful as Maine is today. It's been raining here forever, and now it finally is not. So it's sunny. I actually got out on the water earlier. Okay, you're here, and I want to jump right into things because today's a big day. It is June 12th, 2025. And at a press conference in Los Angeles today with Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, Senator Alex Padilla, who is the most senior Democrat on the Senate Judiciary Committee subcommittee on immigration, citizenship, and border safety, which has oversight of federal agencies that handle asylum, refugees, immigrant enforcement, and so on, was assaulted by security at the event, thrown to the ground, and handcuffed. That is, a sitting U.S. senator elected by his constituents doing his job of oversight of the federal government was assaulted, thrown to the ground, and handcuffed. This is a huge red flag that I'm going to talk more about. But let me just tell you what the administration has said about it. Immediately, the people surrounding Kristi Noem said that he did not identify himself. He's on tape saying, "I'm Senator Alex Padilla of California." So that is obviously a lie. And there has also been in the House of Representatives, the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, has already called for the Senate to censure Senator Padilla. So what they are trying to do is turn this into an attack on Senator Padilla and saying he misbehaved, when in fact, a representative of the federal government assaulted and handcuffed a sitting U.S. senator who was doing his oversight job. This is huge. We have had another example of this in our history that I will tell you about. But one of the things that it's important to remember is that Padilla spoke up right after Kristi Noem, the Secretary of Homeland Security, said something. And what she said, and I believe this is a direct quote, was this: "We are not going away. We are staying here to liberate the city from the socialists and the burdensome leadership that this governor and that this mayor have placed on this country and what they have tried to insert into this city." So let's be clear, actually, what she was saying. That is, the Trump administration has moved the military into Los Angeles to overturn a democratically elected mayor and governor. That's the definition of a coup. And when I said earlier that we've had an example of this before, in fact, if you have heard of the 1898 Wilmington riot in Wilmington, North Carolina, this is precisely what happened. A democratically elected government of a fusion candidates of populists and Republicans elected a government in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898. And in a military coup, the Democrats, who wouldn't put up with that because they didn't like the idea of a multiracial and populist government, overturned it with bullets. And so what she is saying here is that this is what the military is there for in Los Angeles. This is a really, really big deal. So there's a couple of pieces to that I want to point out here. So first of all, we know now that the decision to move to federalize the National Guard of California and to move it into Los Angeles, and then also to move in the Marines, was not a spontaneous decision the way that the administration tried to portray it. And this is one of the reasons they've tried to say that Los Angeles is in flames and that the protesters are violent and so on. And this is simply not true. If you've been watching the news coming out of Los Angeles, you know the protests are in a very limited space and they are overwhelmingly peaceful. The violence appears to be coming almost overwhelmingly from, or not almost, overwhelmingly from the administration side, not from the protesters. So we know from a recent dive by CNN that the administration began to talk of federalizing the National Guard and beginning to militarize different states in order to put their immigration policies into place as early as February. So this has been a long time coming, and it is part, obviously, of a larger plan. But one of the things that I really want to emphasize here now is that if you think about the rise of a fascist or an authoritarian government, they always start to pick on marginalized peoples. But that's not the end game. Those are peoples that they really already can exercise power over. What they are trying to do is militarize against a marginalized population that can't really fight back in order to gain control of the rest of the population. So in this case, if you look at what the administration is doing with regard to undocumented and legal immigrants, the militarization, the building up of the idea that we need more and more soldiers to fight against them. And now gnomes talk about getting rid of the elected government of Los Angeles and California. You can see that transition in this moment from, oh, we're getting rid of the criminals, the rapists and the murderers, to, oh, all undocumented migrants we consider criminals, to, oh, not just undocumented, but also immigrants here legally we consider criminals. Oh, and that's going to include birthright citizens who are here that are the children of immigrants. And now you can see the leap to, we are not going to permit elected governments that are democratic. We are not going to let people elect their own representatives. This is a really big deal, and it illustrates exactly where authoritarian governments go. They start with marginalized people, not because they care so much about having control of those marginalized people. They already have control over those people by definition of the fact they're marginalized. What they want is to use that to build up a military to get control of everybody else. And with the arrest, not just of Senator Padilla today, but the indictment of the New York representative, McIvy, I think her name is. Yes, McIvy. You're seeing this attack on the idea of democratic, small d, democratic government. And this is a really big deal. All right, so a couple of other things here is what's happened since this arrest today. Not arrest, I'm sorry. They handcuffed him, and then they did not arrest him or charge him. I don't believe. Things are changing really quickly on the ground. Democratic senators have spoken up immediately to go to their Republican colleagues and say, you've got to stand up against this. And so far, that has not happened, although things are changing, as I say, even as I'm speaking. But I did also tell you that House Speaker Mike Johnson has firmly come out on the administration side and blamed Senator Padilla for this. And then there are also reports of a shouting matches happening on the floor of the House of Representatives, because nobody, no matter what they say in public, nobody thinks this is a small deal. And the question is how they are going to react to it going forward. I'm going to say more about our role in this in a second, but some of the things you should know are that this budget reconciliation bill that the Republicans are trying to force through has tens of billions of dollars more money in it for ICE and for what they are calling border enforcement. But of course, that's not at all what's going on here any longer. And tens of millions more dollars in it to beef up the military. And as somebody pointed out yesterday, our military right now is not aiming at the very real threats that America has around the world. It is currently aiming at the US people. So today's event and the way we react to it is a really, really big deal. And I, as I say, I'm going to talk more about that, but there are a number of things that I want to reflect on about this moment. So one of the things you're hearing a lot about is outrage, as one should be outraged for any number of reasons. But I'm going to remind you that people only need, as they are rising authoritarians, only need to demonstrate this sort of power and to make these extreme moves when they are weak. If you are fully in control and fully in power, you don't need to make these sorts of demonstrations because you know you're in power. And the incredible weakness of the Trump administration is currently on full view. So one of the things that I'm going to urge you to do is to speak up in this moment. And I know a lot of people are going to be afraid to speak up. And I hope that what I can do here is to suggest to you, this is not a done deal. If anything, the administration looks weaker than strong with a display like this. All right. So here are some of the things that I am looking at. First of all, it matters a lot when people stand up. You know, it matters. It mattered when Harvard stood up, if you remember. But right now, Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, is standing up in really, really important ways. Now, he's not the first. I'm going to talk more about that in a second. But the fact that he is standing up and calling out Donald Trump on X, for example. So if you are on social media, and I don't think you have to belong to X to look, you can go to Gavin Newsom's account and to his press account, and you will see that he has done things like had the voice of Emperor Palpatine reading Trump's tweets with marching Empire soldiers behind them. Those are enormously effective. They've had millions of hits. He's calling out the governors and the lawmakers who are complaining about violence in California by saying things like, hey, Oklahoma has a murder rate 40% higher than California. Or, hey, Alabama's murder rate is 3 times that of California. You know, constantly, he did the same thing to Sarah Huckabee Sanders of Arkansas, although I don't remember that percentage right now. So the fact that he is doing this and he's very much in their faces really matters, because it's clearly now a struggle for control over California, and Newsom is suing. He's in their faces all the time. He's urging them to arrest him. He's really putting them on the line, and he is not the only one. Before him, although he's been doing it to some degree for a while, but before him, J.B. Pritzker of Illinois was very much in their faces. And today on the Hill, where they were talking to the governors of some of these states that are standing up against Trump, he actually said to a Republican who was grilling him, "I will not be talked to like this," and I'm paraphrasing here, by somebody who is an apologist for Adolf Hitler and who pardoned the January 6th rioters. So that standing up enables other people to find their voices. And the reason I mention that is because I urge you, and I'm sorry, I can't believe I didn't think to put her. Of course, the first governor to stand up to Trump was my own governor, Janet Mills, here in Maine. That matters. When people stand up to speak up, call them out, support them, share their material, cheer them on, because we need those voices, and we need other politicians to understand that standing up to this is popular, because we need them to understand that people will stand behind them if they stand up to Trump. Because I think one of the things that we are really seeing here today is exactly what I just outlined, that authoritarians begin by picking on the little people over whom they already have control. But that is designed to build a system in which they can then put down their peers. And, if you watched the fight between Trump and Musk, Musk is now groveling to Trump. And don't think for a minute that Trump doesn't enjoy that. But one of the reasons he is being as horrible as he is right now and escalating to the degree he is because Volodymyr Zelensky's drone attacks on Russia humiliated Putin, who is probably putting pressure on Trump because he couldn't deliver Ukraine to him, as has been the deal all along. And because Trump was so humiliated by people like Gavin Newsom and by Elon Musk when he went after him. So more and more politicians are now recognizing that they're going to be next. It's just a question of time. And now is the time to put pressure, especially on Republicans, to say, really? Because if they can do it to one senator, they can absolutely do it to you. So people like Newsom standing up and other governors standing up have really mattered. And one of the pieces that Newsom is pushing, which I think really is important, and I've been saying it now for a long time, is that Trump is not okay. Trump is mentally not okay. And there are a number of people calling the shots here, and it seems pretty clear that Stephen Miller, the White House Deputy Chief of Staff, is calling the shots over immigration, and he's backed up by Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem. But it's pretty clear that the brains there are not Kristi Noem, that the brains are Stephen Miller. And Trump is going along, but he's actually not on board with the deportations any longer. This morning, he tweeted that he was going to have to, it was a very convoluted thing, but it was on True Social, I'm sorry, it wasn't on X, but that the deportations were hurting a number of businesses who were losing all their workers. And then he had some convoluted idea that somehow fentanyl traffickers were coming to work in the fields. I didn't quite get that part. But at this point, the facade that this is about getting rid of rapists and murderers who have come across the border is gone. This is clearly not about workers. In fact, Republican businessmen want to have undocumented immigrants around because it enables them to have a fairly docile worker population. It is no longer about that. It is now about building a military that is big enough to put down democratic government. I mean, that is just absolutely what's happening here. So we need to push on that because Republican lawmakers can understand that. They know that they will be on the line for that as well. There's another place that Trump has looked very weak today, and I can talk more about other places in which he's looked weak recently. But one of the things that came out in the news over the last day or so is that the administration is talking about sending the citizens of our allies to Guantanamo Bay, to prison in Guantanamo Bay. That's, of course, hugely problematic in so many ways. I'm not even going to start to list them. But the reason that I'm identifying that as a weakness and not a strength is because someone leaked that information. For all the fact that the administration is trying desperately to keep everything quiet, somebody leaked that information to the press, clearly finding it distressing themselves. And again, the administration is trying desperately to operate in the dark. It's trying desperately not to let anybody know what's happening. It's trying desperately to find ways to cow us and to put down a democratic government. And those are all signs of weakness, not of strength. So this last couple of almost a week now, where they have been trying to put in place the use of the military in order, now as we know, to overturn elected officials in Los Angeles and in California. That has in many ways been a sign of weakness as much as it is a sign of attempted strength. So I want people to remember that when we talk now about things that we can do. Um, it is really, really important if you look at other moments like this, like 1898, like the 1850s when we had fistfights in Congress and an attack on a senator on the floor of Congress in May of 1856. That was Charles Sumner. It is really important for people to speak out everywhere, constantly, about how this is not okay. This is not the country we want to live in. This is not the way a democracy should look. And to speak up in support of those who are speaking out at the elected level and at other levels as well. Because as I just said to somebody a few minutes ago, this is going to get worse before it gets better, because the more the Trump administration and the people within it feel that they are on the ropes, the harder and harder they are going to lash out. And right now, they have the power of the federal government behind them, which makes them very dangerous. Again, I'm going to reiterate what I said on Tuesday. Do not assume that the military likes this. The vast majority of military members do not want to be in the middle of a political fight. They're going to follow the orders that they're given that are legal orders. Some people might follow illegal orders, but Trump is making an assumption about the US military that is incorrect. And again, I'm not saying they're going to stand against him. I'm saying you cannot assume that military officers and enlisted personnel are on the side of Donald Trump. In fact, I always remind people 40% of the US military are women and people of color. And I promise you, they are not all lining up behind Donald Trump. And a number of other people do, they signed up to protect the country. They did not sign up for this crazed man doing these things. And they sure as shooting did not sign up to stand behind whoever is actually calling the shots in the White House. So standing up in all of these areas and supporting those people, whether they're in the lawmakers or journalists or teachers or members of the military or doctors and scientists, all the people who are standing up and speaking, lend your voices to that, because now is the time to make it really clear, not to the administration, which already knows it's in a minority. Its polling numbers are terrible in every way, but to make it really clear to lawmakers that it is more valuable to challenge Trump than it is to bow to him. Now is the time to make that really clear. How are you going to do that? You're going to do it, of course, by calling, by writing, by putting up posters, by engaging in music and art, by talking to people, by engaging on social media, by filming short clips on your phone, as we did the Ice Bucket Challenge, and posting them on social media about your concerns, whether about the arrest of Senator Padilla or the indictment of Representative McIvy. Those things, but also the ways in which the cuts to American society are personally affecting you. One of the things that I will be talking about, I thought I'd talk about it today, but I'm going to be talking about it probably tomorrow with certain people, is the fact that the bill that the Republicans are trying to put through calls for the sale of our public lands. There may, and maybe you care about that, maybe you don't, but there are plenty of places you can find that this administration is hurting your life. And now is the time to record those, to spread those. And I have to say, this matters. It matters. Somebody said, don't get engaged on social media. And I say just the opposite, because I cannot tell you how surprised I have been on Facebook when people that I thought were MAGA Republicans are posting things about democracy, and saying Pete Hegseth should resign. And these are literally people I have known my whole life that I thought were fervent MAGA Republicans who are actually closetly really unhappy with where we are. And the more they recognize that they're part of a group of people who feel the same way, the more powerful we will be. So engage any place you possibly can. And again, I'm going to emphasize, as I did the other day, what I am talking about is not violent. It is not fighting against specific individuals. It is demonstrating what America should be in such a way that it encourages other people to join us. And right now, the violence is on the side of the administration. And the political scientists tell us that when the administration engages in violence against nonviolent protesters, the political party that is doing that loses between 10 and 13 points in the next election. That's the group of people that we are going for. Those people who look at what the administration is doing to the nonviolent protesters in LA, to senators and representatives, and they say, listen, I've never been involved in politics before, but I want to be on this side of the equation. We're looking at expanding the coalition that can put pressure on the political system in order to make a change across the board. It's a different kind of protest than one engages in a different set of circumstances. So I'm really trying to push that idea as well. So, I'm seeing here in the comments, people are worried about the 2026 election. Don't worry about the 2026 election yet. What's going to happen in the 2026 election is going to be determined by what happens in the next 3 months. Now, as I've said to you before, we have never in the United States of America canceled an election. Somebody suggested to Abraham Lincoln that he should cancel the 1864 election. He said, if we cancel an election, we have lost our democracy and the Confederates have won. Paraphrase, by the way. And of course, Trump talked about postponing the 2020 election because he knew his numbers were in dire straits. And that, of course, didn't go forward either. What is of much more concern is that we will have an election in which the Republicans in charge of the administration will not permit anyone but themselves to win. And I think what Kristi Noem said today indicates that that's the plan. I think Trump made that very clear in 2021 when he tried to stop the counting of the certificates that proved that President Joe Biden had won the election. And I think what we are seeing right now is a continuation of that, an attempt to use the force of the American government to make sure that Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans are able to control the United States of America forever. And they are trying to do that with this attempt to silence protests and to intimidate lawmakers, intimidate the press, intimidate universities, intimidate scientists, intimidate anybody who is not part of the MAGA Christian white nationalist coalition that they are using to put a very, very small minority of people into power. Once again, I'll remind you that only 4% of Americans who understood Project 2025 wanted to see it go into place. So today is, I won't say it's a wake-up call because a lot of us have been awake for a long time. It is a sign for those people who were not perhaps paying close attention or were hoping that Trump was not going to do the things like that people like us were saying he was going to do, that in fact he is going to do it. And now is the time for people really to take sides and to say, yeah, as Mike Johnson did, we're happy to blame this on the senator who was thrown to the ground and handcuffed. Or for the rest of us to say, no, that this is not what democracy looks like. In the past, when a senator was beaten almost to death on the floor of the Senate, Americans stood up behind him and said, listen, we might not have liked the guy, but we do know that in a democracy, our senators and our representatives are protected under the Constitution, under the speech and debate clause, and they have a right to speak freely and to do their jobs. And that is now very visibly under threat. At the same time that the Secretary of Homeland Security quite literally said that the military was staying in Los Angeles to liberate it from she calls the socialists, which is ridiculous, and the burdensome leadership that the governor and the mayor have placed on the country and what they are trying to do in Los Angeles. It couldn't be much clearer than that. Let me end, though, with hope, which is not false, by the way. This is bad, and it's going to get worse. But think about it. Think about how you people feel here now, and think about how many people there are in the United States who care about our democracy. And think about the fact that this country is being run by a much older man. He's going to be 79 on Saturday, who is clearly not in control of his faculties. And the people calling the shots are people like Stephen Miller and Kristi Noem and Pete Hegseth and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Linda McMahon and J.D. Vance and Mike Johnson. These are not the world's best thinkers. And the reason that they are supporting Trump is because they know that in a free and fair meritocracy, they could never, ever hold positions of power. So think about those people and think about all of us and think about the people that are standing on our side. And I am going to talk here about people like Senator Padilla, people like Adam Schiff of California, people like Jamie Raskin of Maryland, people like J.B. Pritzker, people like Gavin Newsom. Think of people like the senator from Connecticut, Chris Murphy, who was out early on this issue. And then think about the people who are speaking out: George Conway, Pete Buttigieg, Liz Cheney, the people who are speaking out against this administration. And say to yourself, do you really think that 334 million of us in the United States of America, led by people like that, are going to give up in the face of people like Kristi Noem and Stephen Miller and Donald Trump? And that if we stand against them, that we're going to lose? And I think the answer to that has to be no. And I think the reason that the answer has to be no is because if you look at our past and you look at the moments like this, and you think about people like Fannie Lou Hamer, who was a sharecropper, who was beaten almost to death for trying to vote and register people to vote. And you think about people like Abraham Lincoln, who was a corporate lawyer who stepped up to protect democracy. Or you think about Dwight Eisenhower, a kid from the farm, who almost lost his leg when he was 16 to an infection, but he insisted they keep his leg because he wanted to play football. It was his only way he was going to get to college, and that he showed up to defend democracy. And you think about, the people who stepped up to protect disability rights and gay rights. And you think about all those heroes in our past who didn't have money necessarily and who didn't have educations, some of whom couldn't walk. Disability rights, one of the big disability rights activists was a quadriplegic. You think about those people and everything that they had going against them. And then you think about us and everything we have going for us. And I just don't see how you look at that equation and think we're not going to win. So I hope that gives you some hope because it's a bleak day, but I still think that calling it out and making sure now that people understand what really is going on is going to bring more, not less people into the fray. And it's going to give us even more muscle to face what, as I say, is going to be a hard summer. So, anyway, thank you for being here. And I am going to check in more often, I suspect, going forward. And we'll just see how this plays out. God knows we're living through a historic time. Thank you for being here. Hey folks, I'm pre-recording today's politics chat because I have to do something when I normally would be going live. Today is June 17th, 2025, and although I didn't ask for questions today, so many people have written this week, I have a pretty good sense of what's on your mind. Before I get into those questions, I do want to call out that today is the anniversary of the Watergate break-in, June 17th, 1972, when operatives working for the team of President Richard Milhouse Nixon broke into the Democratic National Committee's headquarters in the Watergate complex to bug it. Nixon was very concerned about information coming out about him before the 1972 election. And that from there became the Watergate scandal that in 1974 led to the resignation of an American president for the first time in our history. All right, I always think that that's an important date, especially because nowadays the things that lawmakers are willing to simply accept from the current president makes Watergate, which was a huge scandal and a really important deal, seem sort of quaint. Anyway, the real question that seems to be uppermost in people's minds is a publication that has been circulating that alleges that there was tampering with vote counting machines in the 2024 election. And I want to say from the top here that there are very good people who do election security. There are very good people who look over the numbers for an election and evaluate whether those numbers are realistic or not. And there are very good people who look into discrepancies. And I am none of those people. I have no more information and have no more access to information than anybody else does. And we should all pay attention to what those experts say. Where you are getting this information is from, as I say, this document that's circulating that does have some basis in fact. It appears to be based on a lawsuit that is coming to us out of Rockland County, New York, in which a third-party candidate claims to have gotten more votes than were recorded in that county, especially in the town of Ramapo. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. So what's happened is that a group is suing the county board of elections in Rockland County, claiming that this third-party candidate should have gotten more votes. But in the looking at those votes, they allege that in some of the county, including, as I say, in Ramapo, there were no votes for Vice President Kamala Harris in the 2024 election, although there were votes for other Democratic candidates like Senator Kirsten Gillibrand. So they are suing the Board of Election for a hand count over that third-party candidate, and obviously they're hoping to look into whether or not there was any discrepancies in the presidential election of that year. The election board says all of this is baseless, and all I can say to this is that, we'll see. But at this point, I think unless somebody shows you really hard evidence, somebody, as I say, some of those experts who do this for a living, I would not get terribly exercised about this information. One of the things that I have looked at more closely are the many comments coming from people like billionaire Elon Musk and from President Donald Trump about that election, which seem to me to represent at least some questions about what happened. But that's not the same thing as this document, which alleges a plot without, as near as I can see, anything other than events that happened near each other. So that's the best I can do on that. I did want to call out a couple of other things. One of the things that we are all sort of on tenterhooks about are the many comments that we have seen from the Trump administration and from President Trump since Israel launched an attack on Iran on Friday, attacking Iran's nuclear sites. And I'm not going to get into that struggle itself, but I'm going to get in a little bit here to what that means for American domestic politics, because Trump and the administration appeared to have been caught flat-footed when Israel struck. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who is also acting as the director of national intelligence, he's got a lot of hats, put out a statement saying that the U.S. was not part of that attack and hadn't been informed of that attack. The Israelis said, in fact, we had been. But shortly after that, Trump started to say, well, of course, we did know about it. I mean, it's all very murky what's happening there, but it shows a number of things. First of all, I think it shows that foreign affairs are moving away from the U.S. The U.S. is not the player that it was even 4 or 5 months ago, and it no longer has the kind of influence that it had. Obviously, Prime Minister Netanyahu had wanted to attack Iran in the previous 2 administrations and had not done so. This time he felt he could do so under Trump. So it means that foreign affairs are moving away from the United States, but it also comes at a really important time domestically for the United States, because over the course of the last, well, several weeks, but certainly over the last weekend, Trump has been shown to be really much weaker than he claims that he is and that he wants to project that he is. And this event has given him the ability to try and insist that he's the deal maker and he's the person calling the shots. And since last night, which would have been Monday night, or maybe shortly after Sunday. I kind of lose track of when the Truth Social posts come in. He has been talking and saying really extreme things like people should evacuate Tehran. Well, Tehran is more than 9 million people, 16 million in the metropolitan area. Evacuating that many people is, it was just shocking that he said such a thing. He's also suggested a number of things indicating that he is trying to represent that the power of the U.S. government rests in him and that he is going to use that really freely. What that's going to lead to, I don't think anybody knows. He's been a real loose cannon lately. And the term loose cannon actually comes from naval history, when the cannons aboard a ship were actually chained down because of the recoil from when they were fired. And if those chains broke, a loose cannon was a cannon that was no longer chained to the deck, and a recoil would send it smashing through everything else on the deck. And those were usually, by the way, in the middle of the ship, not at the top of the ship. So it means that you don't know what's going to happen, what's going to go next. And I really love that expression, because I think it really brings on what a loose cannon really is. But when we are thinking about that and what Trump is trying to project to people and what his own injured sense of self needs to project to people, it's also worth remembering that the MAGA movement is bitterly divided about the idea of the U.S. intervening in a foreign conflict, especially in this way. And you will remember that there are those America Firsters who insist the U.S. should not get involved. And then there are other people who are simply loyal to anything that Trump does, like Laura Loomer. And then there are others who are Christian evangelicals who really believe that the coming of their new future is centered in the Middle East, and they are hoping for some major American intervention. And you see that, for example, with U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, a former governor of Arkansas, Mike Huckabee, who has been posting to Trump things that really seem to encourage him to get involved in this struggle between Israel and Iran. So there's a lot going on there. There's a lot of context there that is not reflected only in the sort of normal stuff you're seeing, I think, in accounts of blow by blow what's happening in between Iran and Israel right now. There's also something big that I want to call out that has gotten a lot of attention, but I want to make sure it gets more attention. And that I've talked about before. And I had, outdoor journalist Wes Seiler to interview to talk about this. And last week I interviewed former Senator John Tester from Montana about this. But the story of the Trump administration's attack on our public lands has gotten even more extreme. So what has happened is that we knew that in this budget reconciliation bill that the Republicans are desperate to pass, there was a requirement for the sale of up to 3.3 million acres of land. And that it was mandated in the budget reconciliation bill. And there's any number of reasons why this is simply a handoff to oil and gas, real estate interests, and possibly ranching interests, not least that our public lands actually make money for the American people. They don't lose money. But the idea is to sell these off and use the profits from that sale to pay off the deficit. And the problem, and the theory is that will be good for the American taxpayer. But the reality is that will take away this actually incredibly valuable set of public lands that do actually produce money for us every year. This would be a one-year deal once they're sold off. But also, it's pretty clearly a handoff to big business of American assets. The other thing that I don't like about the sale of public lands is that our public lands currently support small businesses. They support mom and pop industries, and those sorts of industries, especially in rural areas, enable the preservation of democracy because people don't have to work for some company or some mining interest or some real estate firm or in the real estate that it produces. Instead, they have their small organizations or their small businesses that enable them to, support themselves, maybe hire one or two people, and really create the basis for fairness and for democracy. And one of the things that has always happened in the American West is that it has tended to be monopolized by a very few major players who monopolize first the resources and then the government, and then nobody else can get a foothold. And that seems very much what's going on here now. Anyway, we knew that in the bill there was a requirement for the sale of about up to 3.3 million acres of land, an area a bit smaller than the state of Connecticut. But since then, the Senate Energy and National Resources Committee, headed by Senator Mike Lee, who's a Republican of Utah, and the guy who's in such hot water over his making fun of the shootings in Minnesota last weekend, along with Senator Steve Daines, who's from Montana, a Republican from Montana, have added an amendment to the budget reconciliation bill that authorizes the sale of 258 million acres more than that 3.3 million acres over the next 5 years. It includes Bureau of Land Management land, and they manage all different kinds of U.S. recreation areas and wilderness areas and so on, and U.S. Forest Service lands in 11 states. Alaska, Arizona, California, Colorado, Idaho, Nevada, New Mexico, Oregon, Utah, Washington, and Wyoming. You will notice there that Daines has managed to exempt his own state of Montana, where this is enormously unpopular. But in these 11 states, this would authorize the sale of those public lands of 258 million acres of them over the next 5 years. Now, currently, that does not include national monument lands. And national monuments are lands that have been protected for historic, prehistoric, or scientific interests. So that's going to be, the most obvious of those is the Grand Canyon, although we have many of them. Currently, those are not included, but the Department of Justice under Trump is arguing that a president has the right to revoke protections that have been afforded to national monuments. And the reason for this is because Trump and his people want significantly to reduce the land that people like President Biden President Joe Biden put into protection as national monuments. So if in fact they prevail, and there are indications that the Supreme Court doesn't necessarily think that's a bad idea, in fact, these sales could include the national monuments. Right now it doesn't, but they could. And again, this is an issue that I think Americans care deeply about. We do not want our public lands sold off. And yet they're trying to do this under the budget reconciliation measure because they can do it with just a simple majority under budget reconciliation. They cannot do it under the normal procedures of the Senate, where a filibuster could stop something like that. So this is something really important to have on your radar screen and to recognize that it's there. Now, the other thing and the other reason that the administration is pushing the budget reconciliation bill as quickly and as hard as it is, remember they have said they want it signed by July 4th, is because it has significant money in it to beef up the border protection and immigration, customs, and enforcement of the immigration policies of the Trump administration. Because right now, ICE has spent so much money that it is virtually out of money, which by itself is illegal. You're not allowed to spend more money than you've got in the government. They're not supposed to be able to do that. They're running out of money, and they desperately want an injection of more money so that they can increase the deportations that apparently White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller wants so badly. He wants to have a million deportations in Trump's first year in office, and they're running terribly, terribly behind, which is why you are getting these huge sweeps in which they are threatening people and taking people who are here legally. And today there has been an attack on yet another elected official by agents that appear to be ICE agents. I'm a little vague about that still, because they're all masked and they're not wearing badges and they're not wearing names. So for all I know, it's somebody they yanked off the street. That is something I think we need to clear up. Anyway, the budget reconciliation bill gives ICE and border protection a lot more money than they've got. Significantly, it also dramatically beefs up the funding to the U.S. military to almost $1 trillion, or about $1 trillion, which is a significant jump. And as observers have pointed out, right now, the U.S. military is primarily involved in attacking the U.S. So that's another reason that they want to get that bill through very quickly. It's probably a very good thing for you to be speaking up against those measures, as well, obviously, as the ones I've talked about so much. The cuts to Medicaid, the cuts to SNAP, the cuts to the clawback of money from the Inflation Reduction Act, and the cuts to energy rebates to enable people more easily to convert to forms of energy and appliances, for example, that are better for the environment. So there's a lot going on that front as well. And it's happening, one of the things that I find really overwhelming is it's happening all so much and so fast. So in fact, I feel like when I write my letters every night, I can't even begin to cover the material that's there. And do remember that this is a deliberate strategy to exhaust us, to make us feel overwhelmed. And that especially now, as you're seeing more and more, especially threats from the radical right and from the Trump administration, that's because they know how enormously unpopular they are. Polling for the administration on both issues and personalities is underwater on every single issue. Trump is deeply unpopular. His policies, including deportations, are deeply unpopular. And you saw for yourself over the weekend, people really are turning out not just to stand against the Trump administration, but to stand for American values and the things that we care about. So I'm gonna leave you now somewhat shorter than I normally would, because I do need to actually prep for an interview I'm doing tonight. But it's a lot. I know it's a lot, and we're all exhausted. And I'm not going to use profanity, but you can imagine what I do when I've written all day and figure I'm going to get a good night's sleep. And then all of a sudden the news starts dropping at 8 o'clock at night. That's going to happen. It's going to happen more and more. Recognize that you are not alone. Find like-minded people and recognize that we're doing it. Judges are standing against the administration. Individuals are standing against the administration. Lawmakers are standing against the administration. The shooting in Minnesota, coming on top of the attack on Senator Alex Padilla of California, has made a lot of people recognize, even if they don't share the values of the Democratic Party, that they must stand against what this administration is doing to recover American democracy and to recover a Republican Party that can actually serve the American people. There's a lot of people involved, and as I say, they're bringing it. There's a lot of skin in this game, and we're doing it. So get out there, make your phone calls, stay at the local level and the state level and the national level. Keep speaking up. Keep I almost said committing art, but one of the things that I find really powerful in this moment are all the graphic artists and the memes and the jokes. Somebody posted a poster for the No Kings protest the other day that I was crying. I was laughing so hard. That's the sort of thing we need, and we can all do that. So get out there and keep making your voices heard, even when you're exhausted. And when you're too exhausted, take a break, but come back, because we'll be here. And the momentum really does feel like it is running against the Trump administration at this moment. And I got to say, on June 17th, 2025, as I say, the anniversary of the Watergate break-in, that's music to my ears. Thank you for being here. I will be live as normal on Thursday, and we'll just keep on getting it done. Thanks for being here. Hey, folks, how are you? I've just gotten in off the water, and it is cloudy, foggy, rainy, and cold here, pretty much like it's been all summer. But I don't really care. It's worth it just to be out on the water. Although my feet are cold. Anyway, Danny, how are you? I'm glad to see that Facebook is here. Somebody told me that Facebook is disappearing comments today. Lots of changes going on in a lot of different social media accounts, and it just is what it is. Just so you know, I don't have any control over anything that Facebook does. So I do the best I can, and I have a wonderful moderator over there, but it doesn't do any good to write to me and ask, me to have him do something, because I have no contacts. I have nothing to do over there. All right, let me jump in today, because as you know, I've been trying to keep these short. First of all, it is Juneteenth, where I wrote about that last night in the history of Juneteenth, and my team, and by my team, I mean me, my fabulous agent and manager that I've worked with for 30 years at this point, videographer who used to be a student, and a wonderful new comms person we brought on board. When I say that the team that's doing these videos, we released a video on Juneteenth today that I think is good and talks sort of about the larger political history of Juneteenth. So take a look at it if you are interested. I'm a little concerned about how much of our history is being suppressed. So we thought it was probably a good day to put some history out there. And we have another one in the works too. All right. So that being said, yes, the gig I was going to on Tuesday was indeed to interview former President Barack Obama. Didn't advertise it because it was a closed meeting, and it was. I was told they were not going to record it. Obviously, they did record it, and it went well enough that it is now available on YouTube in its entirety. And it was very interesting. People have asked what he had to say. People have asked me to talk about it, and I can't really, for the very simple reason. I was thinking about this while I was out paddling. If you're doing an interview, any kind of an interview, but certainly a fairly high stakes interview, for me anyway, it always reminds me of when we were kids and we used to run on the rocks. And the trick to running on rocks, which is not crazy safe, right, is that you constantly have to be scanning the ground. You constantly have to know where your next step is going to be. And that's what an interview like that is for me, constantly listening, but not to the big picture so much as to the smaller picture, to see where my next in is, what I can pick up, what's the next logical thing to say. So at the end of the day, my memory of that is very much of smaller things that I thought I would pick up on that I didn't get a chance to pick up on. And so as for the whole of it, I probably should watch it myself, because I'm not entirely sure what I could tell you about it that you can't see more effectively if you watch it on your own. The one thing I did note that I thought was really interesting and did not get to pick up is he used the word captured at least 3 times. And that's an unusual word to use. And it's an interesting one in this moment when so many Americans are being captured. I don't know if there was anything behind that, but listen for that word. You'll hear it a number of times. All right. So I'm sorry. I can't tell you more about that. There's just not there's just not a lot there in my head except how one organizes an interview. If it had been the other way around, I could probably tell you a lot more than I can. All right, let me jump into some of the questions that you had. And the first that really seemed to be jumping out to people was the issue of Iran and whether or not the United States is going to go to war with Iran. And I'm going to talk today primarily about larger principles in terms of how one observes politics. So the first thing I would say to you, always, it is a given that the first place you always look when one country attacks another is at the country that's doing the attacking. Because people, at least in the United States, which is the only thing I have any experience with, often make the mistake of seeing countries, especially other countries, as monoliths. And they never, ever, ever are. Even if they are an authoritarian country, even if it seems like one group has all the power, there is always a political contest going on in a country. So whenever you see Russia invade Ukraine, for example, or one country trying to go after another country, it's you have to start with what's going on internally to that country. So that's the first thing I would say when you look at this larger issue here, but also if the United States ends up getting involved somewhere else, as it has done in the past, what is going on internally in that country? Now, I'm not going to talk about Israeli politics, about which I know only as much as anybody on the street does. But that's a really important thing to remember if you think about what's happening right now between Israel and Iran. So let me just give you a little bit of the background. And remember that all of the countries involved have very long histories in the past, and that there are a number of countries, not just Israel and not just the United States, who don't want Iran to develop nuclear weapons capabilities. So that's hanging out there. There's a lot of people who've been trying to stop that from happening for a long time. And if you remember, in 2015, President Barack Obama managed to negotiate what was called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA. You know, just by the way, I have to look up all these acronyms every time too. So if you're like, crap, what is that again? Don't feel like you're not in really good company. They keep throwing acronyms at us all the time. And who knows? But anyway, if you see JCPOA, that's the nuclear deal. That's the Iran deal. You hear about the Iran nuclear deal, and it stands for the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And what that said was that the US, China, France, Germany, Russia, and the United Kingdom would lift economic sanctions that they had against Iran in exchange for limits to Iran's nuclear program. Now, when even at the time that was negotiated, if you remember, there were a number of Republicans in Congress, led actually by Tom Cotton, who was a junior senator at the time, were like, they actually wrote an open letter to Iran saying, don't bother to negotiate with Obama, because the second we get back in power, we're going to tear this deal up. And that is, in fact, that is, in fact, what happened when Trump was elected and then took office in 2017. In 2018, he pulled the United States out of the JCPOA, out of the Iran nuclear deal. And he said he was going to negotiate a better deal. Now, it's worth remembering that this is kind of an MO of Trump's. He tears something up, and then he basically tries to renegotiate what was already there and then put his own name on it. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. More often doesn't than does. But he said, he was going to renegotiate and get a better deal. Well, what he did was he put onto Iran what he called a maximum pressure campaign to get it to agree to another version of a sort of joint comprehensive nuclear deal. And in fact, that didn't work. So now that he is back in power, in February of 2025, he reinstituted the plan of maximum pressure to try and force the Iranians to a deal. But also, that was February. And then in March, his director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, said that the American intelligence community assessed that Iran was not, in fact, close to developing a nuclear weapon. Just hold that out there. Also in March, then, Trump sort of changed his tune. He actually said to the Fox News channel that he had sent a letter to the supreme leader in Iran saying that that they should start to negotiate, because nobody, if the U.S. had to come down on them militarily, it wasn't going to end well for them. And the Iranians began by saying, stop it. We're not going to give in to your pressure. But by April, they said, yes, they were willing to talk. Now, again, when I said you got to think about sort of all the different players here, remember that Iran had backed those non-state actors I keep talking about in Lebanon, Yemen, and Hamas in Gaza. And they had been badly, badly hurt, those different non-state actors. Hamas had been hammered since the October 7th, 2023 attack on Israel. Israel had also been hammering Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the U.S. especially had been hitting the Houthis in Yemen. So all of their proxies were significantly weaker. And by April, they suggested that, in fact, they were willing to talk. So discussions began in April, and there have actually been 5 sets of negotiations between the U.S. and Iran taking place in places like Oman. And they haven't agreed to anything, but they're talking, that sort of thing going on. And that's where things stood last week, when there was to be yet another meeting in Oman on Sunday, I think it was the 15th of June. There was supposed to be another meeting when they were going to keep negotiating, the U.S. and Iran, and negotiators were supposed to be working on this issue. But in all of this, the United States had largely cut out Israel's Netanyahu. Now, remember, again, Israel's got a number of political parties. Netanyahu has just gone through a vote that looked pretty dicey. There's a lot going on in Israel as well. Again, I'm not going to get into that, but remember, these are not, this is one of the things about politics that is really interesting, but also somewhat maddening, is that it's constantly a moving target. People are changing all the time, and positions are changing all the time. So, it always sort of frustrates me when someone says, well, you believed that 25 years ago. It's like, well, it was a whole different world then. So anyway, Israel had been had been cut out of these discussions. And on June 12th, which was last Thursday, Netanyahu's government struck Iran, hitting nuclear facilities and senior military officials, killing a bunch of them. And this is so this is where the U.S. now I'm turning back to the U.S. and I hope this is useful. I know it's a lot of moving pieces, but so what happened, if you think about it, that night, I remember because I was writing and I had just written a whole letter, and then that happened, and I'm like, really, come on. The U.S. Secretary of State, who is Marco Rubio, the former Florida senator, issued a statement in which he said the U.S. had nothing to do with this. Israel acted unilaterally, and Iran should not hit American military personnel. Remember, though, that Rubio is also the acting national security advisor, because remember, the first national security advisor was Brian Waltz, and he's the guy who invited the Atlantic journalist onto the Signal chat where they were planning military strikes on the Houthis in Yemen. And so Trump just said, oh, we're not going to do that again. We'll just get Rubio to cover the national security advisor role as well. So when Rubio came into that particular office, he's acting, by the way, he's not confirmed. When he came into that, he got rid of a lot of people in the National Security Council. So the White House is operating with virtually no, maybe not even virtually no, diplomats or national security people. I shouldn't say diplomats because we still have diplomats, national security people or military crisis people in this moment. They don't really have anybody. The people that they have got are Rubio, who's filling both of these roles, plus um, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, who has really no experience at all in this, and Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence. And though they have both been sidelined, according to the Washington Post, and Trump is sort of saying he's going to handle all this on his own. And we know that Trump basically keeps insisting he's the world's best negotiator. He recently said he could have negotiated the way out of the Civil War. But the reality is, if he was a good negotiator and it looked like things were going in a good direction, Netanyahu would not have struck Iran. He didn't strike Iran under Biden, and he didn't do it under Trump the first time when Trump had some adults in the room. Now he feels like he's got the leeway to do that. All right. So Rubio comes out and he says, we had nothing to do with this. However, in the very early days of the strikes, they looked pretty successful. Now, Iran's been striking back with missiles, but at the beginning of the days, it looked like it was a really good, hit, and it was going to be a victory. And all of a sudden, Trump started posting on social media that the U.S. seemed to be involved. He began to take credit for the strike, saying it was American hardware that had done them, and insisting that Iran would make a deal. And then that was Friday. And then on Saturday, of course, were the No Kings protests, which were huge, about 2% of the U.S. population, and at least, and his military parade, which really fizzled, which, by the way, was kind of sad as an American. The idea of showcasing American eras of military was actually pretty cool. They only had 2 months to do it, and it looked like it was his birthday party, and he didn't disabuse anybody of that idea. And I'm just kind of giving a shout out here to the soldiers and sailors who worked on that. Anyway, so that happened Saturday, right? So, and I'm trying to build up a picture here, obviously. But there is an important piece here, and that is that the United States is the only military that has a bomb that can get deep enough underground to actually hit the places where Iran appears to be developing nuclear capabilities, if indeed it is doing so. And so there's pressure on the U.S. to produce the one kind of plane that can carry this bomb, which is 30,000 pounds. It's called a massive ordnance penetrator, to deliver it to Iran. So there's pressure on the U.S. to participate on the side of Israel. All right. So Trump, when he was at the G7 in Canada, kept sort of pressing the idea that maybe the U.S. was going to get involved. And, he keeps saying Iran can't have a nuclear weapon. And then sort of out of the blue, he says, everyone should immediately evacuate Tehran. More than 9 million people live in Tehran, and more than 16 million live in the immediate area. That's a little bit, I think it's a little bit bigger, actually, than the state of Pennsylvania. It's like saying to the state of Pennsylvania, everybody out. I mean, it was just a weird, weird thing to say. And then he left the G7. And when France's Emmanuel Macron said he's gone to negotiate a ceasefire, he kind of exploded on social media and says, no, I'm doing something much bigger than that. He's got it wrong. Stay tuned. And then he started to say, we have control over the air in Iran, and we know exactly where the supreme leader is hiding. We're not going to kill him right now, but we know where he is. Again, suggesting that the U.S. was involved. But it certainly seemed as if he kind of wanted a quick win, and it was kind of, I'm going to stamp the Americans on this because it looks like it's going to win. But then it became really clear really quickly. And again, we're talking, this is all happening in a week. This is a week of time. A week ago at this time, if you look back at the tape I did, I wasn't talking about this. But then MAGA, his supporters, split very badly over this, because there are the isolationists who don't want America involved in foreign wars at all. Remember, we've been pulling out of everything right and left because America first, and we're going to be isolated. And that's people like Steve Bannon, for example, and Tucker Carlson, both media people who insist that the U.S. should not be involved anywhere. And on the other hand, in the MAGA movement, you have the evangelicals who believe that Israel is central to the second coming of Jesus Christ before the end days. And they believe that America should always intervene on the side of Israel. And they're represented by people like the American ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, the former Arkansas governor, who messaged Trump. At least Trump put something that purported to be a message from him on Truth Social, basically urging Trump to use missiles, including the potential for nuclear missiles on Iran. It was really kind of an astonishing statement. So MAGA started to split over this, and they're really, really at each other's throats over this. At the same time, Iran started to hit back. And it became clear that this was not going to be a one and done. And yet at the same time, the news has kept the focus entirely on Trump. So one of the things, so Trump loves this. He's center of attention again, and nobody's talking about the parade, and nobody's talking about the No Kings protest. And all of a sudden, the whole world is waiting on Donald Trump again. So he's loving it. But there's really not very much he can do that isn't going to upset somebody and put him in a bad position. So what he has done is he's repeatedly said, I get to decide. I'm the one, you don't know what I'm going to do. I might do it, I might not, and kept the cameras on himself. And yet today he had Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, come out with a statement in which he said, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'll let you know within the next 2 weeks, which suggests he's probably hoping to kick the can down the road and hope that the problem will go away, because there is no way he can split that baby that is going to keep MAGA together. And as soon as a war breaks out, as soon as America gets involved in a war, he's not going to be the center of attention anymore. The war will be the center of attention. And people aren't going to like it. Americans are very, very, very tired of wars in the Middle East. So the other important piece here, of course, is what I wanted to get into with the other things I want to talk about today, is the idea that a president can decide to go to war on a whim is bonkers. It is just straight up bonkers. The Constitution gives the power to declare war to Congress, not to the president. And since World War II, Americans have really walked away from that, and we have given more and more and more power to the president to declare war, to declare military actions. And there's some guardrails around that I've written about really quite a lot. But especially since 9/11, there has been a tendency to let the president take the reins and do whatever he wants, because he keeps arguing that it's about national security, and nobody wants to be the one out there speaking against national security in times of war. Well, in this case, Trump is enough of a loose cannon that a number of lawmakers from both parties, Democrats as well as Republicans, have said, wait a minute here, this is us. This is not you. You don't get to do this. And so there are a number of measures in front of Congress right now to try and dial him back and say, you can't start a war without even consulting the Congress. And the Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia, a Democrat, is out front in this, as is Bernie Sanders, an independent of Vermont, they both have a lot of co-sponsors on measures, first of all, that say, hey, that's power is ours. And second of all, that say you can't have any money to get involved in doing anything with Iran without running it by us first. So that question there of is Congress going to start to claw back some power from the president is a really important issue right here, because we should not be going to war on one person's say so, let alone one person's say so who is so clearly mentally unstable. And one of the things that I think comes out of this moment that is worth remembering and examining at this moment is that Trump thrives on confusion. He thrives on pitting people against each other and on sort of wait till you see what I'm going to do next. That's really good for him because it gives him a lot of eyeballs. It's really bad for the rest of us because, the business people can't make decisions about their businesses because we don't know what the tariffs are going to be in 2 days. People don't know how to maneuver in any number of places because you can't plan, because he is keeping himself central to everything. And this, I think, really highlights it. The fact that the whole world is watching this man who literally yesterday told reporters, I pulled this quote, I mean, you don't know that I'm going to even do it. You don't know, I may do it. I may not do it. I mean, nobody knows what I'm going to do. Nothing's finished until it's finished. War is very complex. A lot of bad things can happen. A lot of turns are made. This is not diplomacy. This is not any kind of a measured approach to the commitment of American resources. And I think it's the sort of thing that may in fact help to wake people up to the fact we don't want a dictator. Again, this is not exactly, but this is the sort of thing that Vladimir Putin did when he invaded Ukraine in 2022. His people now, they've lost 1 million people in that war. The Russians have. And they didn't have any say in it. He just decided to do this. It was the sort of thing that people who were looking at it diplomatically kept thinking he's not going to do it because it will just devastate Russia. He didn't care. He did it anyway. And now if you look both at the Russian people, but also at the destruction of their economy, you just have to shake your head. So that's what's going on with Iran. You want me to tell you whether or not what he's going to do? I don't know what he's going to do. I will tell you that politically attacking Iran is a terrible move for him because it will infuriate basically everybody. So, but that's not to say he couldn't say, well, you're not the boss of me, and do it anyway. But that's where we stand on that issue. All right. I wanted to get to a couple other things because I think they tie together, and I ran over on that. I'm sorry. And I'll try and do these a bit more quickly. You asked me to talk about the Supreme Court's decision yesterday for minors, transgender minors. And I want to do a similar thing with that issue that I just did with Iran, and that's to back up a little bit. Because before you think about the issue of medical care or children or transgender Americans or any number of those sort of immediate issues, there is the issue that I wish we talked more about. And that's that rights are not a la carte. When I hear people saying, well, people shouldn't talk about trans rights or people shouldn't talk about those rights because people don't like those things, you don't get to pick and choose who has rights unless you're willing to admit the principle that some people have rights and other people do not have rights. And if you're willing to admit that principle, then it's only a question of time until you're one of the groups that does not have rights. So that decision yesterday stood on the same grounds that the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health decision stood, the decision that overturned Roe versus Wade. And this is really important because what those two decisions do is they make a really important argument that has been part of American history since the 1830s. And that's that American democracy is served so long as people in a state pass a law. And that's what a true democracy should be, because at the state level, people are more involved in democracy. They pay more attention. And if that's what if that's what a state wants, if they want to get rid of abortion rights, for example, that's fine because they have voted for that. And this, I'm sorry, the word for this is poisonous, because that is the reason that Americans developed that argument in the 1830s was because it was very clear that the vast majority of Americans did not support the institution of human enslavement. So what happened was those people in the states that wanted to preserve enslavement developed this argument that democracy really resided in the states. And so long as the states voted to first take indigenous Americans' lands in 1830 and promote human enslavement, that was a democratic outcome. But here's the kicker to that. The people who were in charge decided who got to vote. I promise you that if Black Americans had been able to vote in those states where they were enslaved, or if Indigenous Americans had been able to vote over the fate of their lands, the outcome would have been extraordinarily different. And this is what we are seeing in this moment. The radical people who have taken over the Republican Party are limiting who gets to have a say in those states. And by limiting that, they are doing things like taking away the rights of trans children and their parents to make decisions with their doctors about that care, to take away rights to abortion, to take away all sorts of other rights that should be guaranteed under the Constitution to begin with, but also under the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. So one of the things that the reasons I'm pointing that out is because you're seeing this in a really big way among the radical Republicans who are taking over the American government. They are trying to center things in the states where they can determine who gets to vote and where they can drown out the majority in order to push staunchly pro-business legislation like letting children work in factories. They're taking rights away from trans children. They're taking away abortion rights. They're taking away rights that they believe infringe on the Christian nation that they want to construct. So I guess I'm sort of suggesting that rather than focusing on simply saying this particular decision is an attack on a certain kind of rights, it's an attack on all of us. And protecting those rights and protecting the right to equality before the law for all Americans is not dividable. You can't a la carte it, like I say. Either all of us have rights or none of us have rights. And that's sort of the way that I'm thinking about that particular decision and how I'm intending to talk about those decisions, because well, first of all, because that's how Lincoln talked about Black rights in a time when Black rights were really controversial. But also because I think it is right that either we all enjoy the same rights in this incredibly complicated, multicultural, multi-religious, sort of crazy quilt of a country, or we start to say we can divide who gets rights in this country and who doesn't. And the people who are saying that some people get rights and some people don't right now is where I wanted to finish today. And that's with what's really happening with the assault and handcuffing of Senator Alex Padilla of California, a Democrat of California, and with the arrest of the New York City comptroller, which is the person who controls the money in the city. This is not, he's not a small figure. And the violence that you're seeing and the use of masked people, we don't know who they are, on the streets to grab individuals, especially marginalized Americans who are weaker than the men who are arresting them. And by that, I mean largely unarmed women and children. That's very much a trope in American history. It's a pattern in American history. You create a villain and then you hurt their marginalized people, their really weakest people. And this is a huge thing in Indigenous history where the army would decide to go after the warriors in a tribe. And what they would end up doing is I'm sorry, but massacring the women, children, and elderly. And I can just give you a whole list of places where that happened, simply because that's the low-hanging fruit. They're the easy people. Far easier to grab a woman who's nursing a baby than it is to grab, a 24-year-old armed man. So that I think is what we're seeing. And the glorification of that violence among the MAGA Republicans, and you saw that with Senator Mike Lee's really disgusting attacks on Minnesotans and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz after the violent shooting of two state lawmakers in Minnesota over the weekend, early Saturday morning. That glorification of violence is part of this idea of minority rule. The reality is, as not just people like me, but as the one thing I remember former President Barack Obama saying the other night, if you look at how Americans stand on most issues, the vast majority of us agree. We are not divided over even things that are hot button issues. We're not divided over the idea of protecting women's right to health care. We are not divided over things like common sense gun safety legislation. We are actually not divided over the idea of higher taxes on the very wealthy. We're not divided over the idea of not cutting our social services. This bill that the Republicans are trying to get through Congress is really, really unpopular. About 27% of people who know what's in it like it. 27% of people, that's nobody. That's really low. We're really agreed on the vast majority of things that we want to see coming out of our country. We want to deal with climate change. We actually like the FDA. We like the NOAA. We like the National Weather Service. By large numbers. This is not me going we have 50.1%. By large numbers, Americans like these things, and they're going to like them more as they see what happens when we get rid of them. So, for example, there has been just a deadly outbreak, I think it's of listeria in certain kinds of foods. We don't like those things. We want an FDA, and we want inspectors that stop that. So those people who are trying to impose Christian nationalism that continues to funnel money upward significantly to a teeny minority of us, recognize that if in fact they are going to maintain their power, they've got to stop the rest of us. They have to cow us. They have to make us afraid and make us be quiet. And that celebration of violence and the idea of getting people to turn out to commit violence is really a mirror in the present of how the white supremacists in the late 19th century managed to shut people up and permit the remanding or the putting back of Black Americans into a subservient position after the Civil War. That's the point of terrorism. You don't have to get everybody. You just have to show up enough that you get most people scared that they're going to be next. And that's how you terrorize a majority into putting up with a minority. And this is something in power. And this is something that Homeland Secretary Kristi Noem actually said the other day, that Homeland Security was going to keep people in Los Angeles in order to get rid of the mayor of Los Angeles and the governor of California, both of whom are elected and popular, at least in Newsom's case. I haven't seen the numbers for Karen Bass. Because they are, they're going to get rid of this socialist government. It is not a socialist government. It is a government that is standing against fascism that is developing in this country and is really getting a handhold here. And that I think these things go together. You see Iran and the attempt of Trump to gather all the power for war making into his own hands. You see this attack on trans rights because that's an incredibly vulnerable population. But once you can get people to turn against this very small, very vulnerable population and say, oh yeah, we're going to take rights away from them, then you have gotten people to admit the possibility that some people can have rights that other people don't. And once you've done that, man, are the gates open for you to say, well, you don't get that right. You don't get to vote. You don't get to go to school. You can work all night. All those protections are gone. And in order to do that, you've got to keep a really small minority in power. And that, I think, is what we're seeing here, is this attempt to create this violent ecosystem in which this minority of MAGA Republicans can stay in power. And this, again, as I've said before, is one of the reasons they're desperate to get this budget reconciliation bill through Congress quickly, is because what it does is it pours lots more money into Homeland Security, border security, and the Army. And where is the military operating right now? It's operating in the United States. It's operating against us. So these stories, I think, all go together into this one big story about, in this moment, what is American democracy and how do we protect it? And first off, let me just remind you that they would not be doing this sort of performative violence if they were truly in control. It's an axiom. If you have to demonstrate that you're in control, you are not, right? So it continues to be incredibly important to use our voices to push back against all of these things that matter to you. And you can do it, as I say, through speaking up. There's all these apps now where you can make 5 calls in a day, where you can reach out to your lawmakers, both at the national level and at the state level. And I urge you once again to get very involved at the local level and at the state level. Lots of different organizations that can help you do that. If you're in a blue state and you want to help elsewhere, lots of national organizations where you can work. You need to use your voice, speak up on social media, share stuff that you think is important. And I have to say, my comms person has been really good about dividing my material up into really bite-sized pieces, especially on Instagram, but she's available elsewhere. Share that stuff. I will never try and sell anybody anything, I promise you. So you don't have to worry there's like a pyramid scheme here or something. Share material on social media, but also talk to people. Get out there, get into public places where people are talking about issues that matter to you. And it doesn't have to be big national issues. It can be, should we build a fish ladder or not? Because you recognize that people might disagree about a lot of stuff, but they do agree on the big things that we need them to agree on. And these are the coalitions that we need to be forming in this time. So, I remain hopeful about all this. I think we're calling stuff out, and I think people are seeing it. That being said, really interesting today, I saw a statistic on how few Americans actually know what's in the budget reconciliation bill. When they do know, they hate it, but they don't know what's in it. And somebody said, well, this is a failure of mainstream media. And I thought, well, yeah, but we're not going to get mainstream media to change. If they were going to do it, they'd have done it by now. But you know what? There are millions of us who do know what's in that bill. And we all have friends. We can tell people too. We don't have to wait for a major newspaper to tell people what's happening. This is exactly what people did in the 1850s, and even more impressively in the 1890s, when they pushed back against the robber barons. And then really crucially, in the 1930s and the 1940s and the 1950s, when the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, said, nobody's covering the issues that are affecting the Black community so profoundly, especially issues like lynching, but more than that, education and discrimination in jobs and so on. So we're going to do it. And they did. And it was that publicity campaign, if you will, but I'm not suggesting they took out ads, although they did have posters and things like that. That publicity campaign is what made people recognize what was happening. And once people in power recognized what was happening, they changed things. And we can do the same thing. So I'm calling you out, music, and especially artists, art in this moment that catches people's eye. Well, you can see I'm doing videos now. That matters. So, I know we're scared. I know there's a lot going on, but we're not done. We're not done by a long shot. And I urge you to keep on speaking up, Um, for all the terrible stuff that's happening, the backlash is there, the people are there, the enthusiasm is there, and I was thinking the other day, for me, every day is a new day, and I wake up and every day starts again. And then I thought, it has literally been 10 freaking years since Donald Trump came down that escalator. And so, I often talk about how the difference between the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, when it looked like the enslavers had gotten everything, through January 1st, 1863, when Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation, is about 9 years. I thought, really profound transformative change can be incredibly quick, as I've talked about before. But, we're already 10 years into this, and that momentum is absolutely there. So, keep the faith, and we'll keep at it. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you tonight.